couple of years ago, I went on vacation with a couple of friends of mine. My friend Kelly came from a place called Chatter Blinds up in New England. While her family had long since moved out, they kept a summer home in the area. Small town living in a place down by the coast, sign me up. There were 4 of us in total. Kelly, who arranged the whole thing, was a work friend of mine. Then there was Marie. I didn't know her very well, but she and Kelly went way back to the point where they could probably finish each other's sentences. Finally, there was Annie. I didn't know her all that well, but I'd seen her around the office a couple of times. Apparently she was related to Marie somehow, but I hadn't bothered to ask how. So on a late Thursday afternoon, we headed for a New England Labor Day weekend. Chatter Blinds is a peculiar town just past Brunswick. The place is along the coast and houses at most a couple of hundred people. Most of it looks sort of frozen in the 1970s, and you can tell by the sun-beaten signs that not a lot has changed since then. We made our way to the old summer home at the edge of town. It was the kind of place where you needed firewood to keep warm in the winter and where your water might suddenly run out. There was a well on the property. Electricity was spotty at best, and there was a massive wasp nest hanging from the southwestern corner of the roof. Still, it was exactly what we bargained for. Cheap country living. Our stay there took some time getting used to, but by Friday night we were having a blast. We took a rowboat out to a sauna on a small island and had margaritas. We spent Saturday touring the town and having a bite to eat at the local pub. We met one of the local fishermen who offered to take us out on a trip on Sunday, which we all heartily agreed to. Subsequently, Sunday turned out great. Sure, we had to get up early, but we were feasting on freshly smoked lobster by the end of the day. We were having a bit of trouble, though. There were a couple of locals who weren't all enthused about a bunch of metropolitan women coming to see their town, so we had to endure more than a handful of nasty comments. They were just stupid kids, but it was definitely the worst part of the trip. There was this one blonde kid with a white shirt that just refused to stop smirking at us. His baby sister, aged 10 or 12, didn't seem all too enthused either. When Sunday rolled around, we were ready to go home. Before we did, Kelly decided to give us a final tour. Marie remarked on something peculiar, that there was no church in town. Towns like this always got a church, she commented. It's just strange is all. It's the bedrock, Kelly commented. Most of the town is built on solid bedrock. So just build a church on the bedrock. Can't have a graveyard built on bedrock, Kelly shrugged. Most folks who died back in the day were shipped off to either Brunswick or Wiscasset. Kelly stopped for a moment, considering something. Checking her phone, she nodded. We got time, she smiled. You got to see this one last thing. The casket cellar. She took us to the north side of town. We followed a dirt road into the woods where there was this bulging dirt mound. Not just like a pile, but like a small structure. It was clearly man-made, but hadn't been used in decades. It was covered in wildflowers in this perfect circle, like a place of worship. There was a solid oak door in the middle of it. The road was severely overgrown with weeds and fallen trees, showing just how few people went out of their way to see this place. A couple of rusted-out logging machines lay to the side. Just looking at them made me feel like I needed a tetanus shot. This is one of few patches of land around that isn't just solid rock, Kelly said. It was too small to build a graveyard, but they figured they could make a kind of storage. As a storage for what Annie squinted at her. For a while it was logging stuff, but back in the day it was dead folks. Like a temporary thing before the bodies were shipped off north. So it's like a cooler. A cellar, said Marie. Yeah, Kelly nodded. People don't use it anymore, but it's sort of a morbid local curio. We all fell silent for a moment. Kelly turned to me with the biggest grin. Want to check it out? Of course we wanted to see it. We were 4 women in our mid-30s hopped up on true crime podcasts and Stephen King novels. This was the sort of thing that gave me the goosebumps. I'd never heard of anything like it. A body cellar? Sick. The door took some convincing to open, but we managed to squeeze through. The air was damp and cool, much colder than expected. Using our phones as flashlights, we walked down a narrow set of stone steps deeper into the ground. The cellar was about 9 by 9 feet, and we had to crouch not to hit our heads on the ceiling at times. The ground was solid bedrock, but the walls were a combination of propped-up planks and deep dirt holes. They reminded me of the wasp nest back at the house, where you could see these deep chambers built into it. It was the same here, about a dozen holes in the wall, going deep into the dirt. Of course, there was nothing there. The place hadn't been used for decades, maybe even a century. There was some kind of opening somewhere, as I could feel a puff of cold air going through the room, but I couldn't see any ventilation or opening. To add to the ambience, Kelly decided to light an oil lamp she found in the corner. We were a bit skeptical, but it seemed to work well enough. She hung it on a hook in the middle of the room. The light flickered a little as we turned off our flashlights and looked around the room. There were these small notches in every hole where caskets were once slid in. There were tools along the left-hand wall. Things like hooks to drag the bodies out, hammers and rusted nails to fix broken casket lids, masks to shield workers from swarms of flies. Every item told a story, and once you put it all together, it painted a grim picture. This place had been something real and sorrowful. This wasn't a tourist attraction, it was a remnant of a grim reality. This was a place of necessity, not curiosity. I felt a little bad about it and suggested we leave. Marie and Kelly wanted to take a couple of pictures, so they asked me to help. They sat down by the edge of one of the holes and pretended to look scared. I took a couple of photos while Marie giggled about having a new Tinder pic. I wasn't amused, it was too morbid. That cellar was uncomfortable. We turned to leave, hurrying up the stairs. Annie was first. As she reached the door and pushed on it, she stopped. She pushed again and again. "It's stuck," she said. Hold on." She tried a couple more times but couldn't get it to budge. She switched places with Kelly, who was the more athletically gifted of us. Kelly gave it a proper shoulder push, but the door didn't move an inch. She gave it another push, a kick, and an impressive effort, but it didn't move. Then I heard something. Giggling. It was those goddamn kids. They'd locked us in and put something against the door. Annie yelled at them to let us out or we'd press charges. That just made them giggle more. It didn't take long until we could hear them leave, with a faint bye, echoing off in the distance. While Kelly and Marie took turns punishing the door, Annie and I tried to get a signal on our phones. Even at the very top of the stairs, we were still underground and off the grid. This place was isolated and we couldn't get a signal through. Kelly and Marie came back down dripping with sweat. Annie was curled up in a corner, trying not to panic. There was no doubt about it. We were stuck for the time being. Maybe someone would pass by and let us out. Kelly tried to use some of the tools to break the door, but it didn't work. The hammers were termite-ridden and the handles were falling apart. There was a saw, but the blade was rusted straight through. There were hooks for dragging out caskets, but these were useless when it came to breaking doors or hinges. We were stuck down there for a couple of hours. Things were getting dark outside and we could feel a wind growing colder. Annie was having some sort of panic attack and had resorted to desperately pounding on the door, screaming for help. The rhythmic thumping and yelling were boring into my brain to the point where I could still hear it in the quiet moments where she stopped. Kelly had run her phone battery dry trying to find a spot with a signal. Marie had just fully given up and collapsed against the wall, taking a stress-induced nap. The oil lamp was still burning strong. Kelly had tried to set the door on fire, but it just wouldn't catch on. The air was too damp and it only resulted in smoke blowing down into the cellar. It seemed that no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't MacGyver ourselves out of this one anytime soon. It was getting annoying since we all had work in the morning, and we'd have to drive late into the night to make it back on time at this rate. Inevitably, we turned on one another, blaming each other for provoking the locals for not keeping the door open for going there in the first place. Annie went on a long rant about how we all could have gone to Aruba instead, where she had a half-sister who ran a bar. Marie had fully checked out at that point, turning from napping to silently weeping. There was no way we'd be left there for long. If the kids had found us, others would too. "We just have to make sure we're heard," I said. "That's all we can do." We took turns pounding on the door, calling out for help. Even Marie joined in, although not as energetically as the rest of us. We rationed our water bottles, sharing what little we had between us. It went on and on for hours. Banging on the door, call for help, banging on the door, call for help, over and over and over and over. We were lucky that cellar was empty, or that kind of brain-dead monotony would be annoying enough to wake the dead. It got colder a lot quicker as the sun set. There'd already been an overcast during the day, so we figured it wouldn't be long until it started to rain. Maybe someone would come looking for us in the morning. The four of us not showing up for work ought to raise a few eyebrows. We huddled together for warmth, watching the light of the oil lamp flicker back and forth. There was a cold chill reaching us, pulling me back from the brink of an exhausted sleep over and over. It must have been close to midnight when I looked up to see Annie standing in the middle of the room, staring down the holes in the wall. She was breathing heavy, as if trying to psych herself up. I squinted at her, trying to get the sleep out of my eyes. "What are you doing?" I whispered, as to not wake the others. I heard something she said, "In there." She pointed straight into one of the hole. As she did, an icy wind swept through the cellar, swirling the dirt around and stinging my nose. Marie shuddered in her sleep. "I'm gonna look," said Annie, real quick. I got up and stood behind her. She crawled into the hole face first. She could barely move, but I promised to pull her out by her feet if I had to. As she got to the back of the hole, I couldn't see anything but her shoes sticking out. "Anything?" I asked. "No," she sighed. "I think it's just some." She stopped. Another wind passed through the room, this time a little stronger. The oil lamp swayed and fell off the hook, falling to the ground with a clunk. The flame went out as Marie and Kelly sprung awake. For a moment, everything went deathly quiet. I felt this strange sensation in my chest, something tightening over my ribs like my blood constricting, something poking my heart to provoke it into racing. "Annie," I whispered. "Nothing." I picked the lamp up, lit it, and hung it back up. I could see her feet dangling at the edge of the hole, not moving an inch. Then she moved. A sudden lurch. Her legs motionless, moving further down the hole, as if something was dragging her in by the head. I grabbed her foot and felt a tug on the other end. A sudden pull, and her shoe came off. The hole went deeper than we thought. A lot deeper. Marie and Kelly panicked. Marie rushed up the stairs and resumed banging on the door while Kelly battled against her instincts to follow Annie into the hole. She poked her head in to look, but couldn't bring herself to go further, instead pulling at her own hair in frustration. I didn't even notice how I'd stumbled backwards toward the opposite end of the room, flattening myself against the wall. It was subconscious. As Marie and Kelly panicked, running back and forth, all I could do was to look at Annie's shoe. It still lay there at the edge of the hole, the same hole we'd used for a nice profile picture earlier in the day. A stray thought hit me. I still had some battery left on my phone, not much, but a little. As the screams for help faded into screams for Annie, I fumbled through my photo album. I didn't even notice how much my fingers were shaking until I had to precision tap which image to view, where I picked the wrong one at least 3 times. Finally, I brought up the picture of Kelly and Marie standing in front of that hole. The flash had gone off, giving them a bit of an eerie glow, but it also allowed me to see straight into the hole behind them. There were these 10 white spots in the dirt, laid out in a sort of crescent semicircle. They were too dull to be eyes or glass. They weren't really reflective. My mind wandered as I pondered the possibilities, my eyes blurred, looking away from the screen and down onto my dirty hands, my pale thumbs holding the device in a cramp. Looking back at the picture, I couldn't help but to see a similarity. 2 sets of 5 deep in the dirt. Fingers. I took down the oil lamp and carefully moved up to the hole. Kelly and Marie joined me. We looked inside only to see that the back end of the wall was gone. Instead, it was just this hole going deeper into the dirt at a slight tilt. This wasn't just an abandoned cellar, it was something's nest. We all stopped to listen. Further in, almost as if coming from below our feet, we could hear a sound travel, the faint noise of fabric being torn, the pop of buttons coming off and zippers being torn open, the shuffling of hair, then a sickening crunch, the breaking of bones. We backed away. Marie was having trouble breathing. Kelly tried to calm her down, carefully stroking her shoulders, hushing her. We spoke in whispers, leaving the oil lamp hanging in the middle of the room. "We're not getting out," Kelly whispered. "We have to wait until they find us." "There's something in there," I whispered back. "We have to do something." We got to get Annie out," sobbed Marie. "We can't leave her in there." "I'm not sticking my head in, and neither are any of you," Kelly snapped back. "We're getting out and we're getting help." We all decided to try one thing each. Marie was going to check one of the other holes to see if there were any other tunnels, possibly leading outside. There was fresh air coming from somewhere, so there had to be some kind of connection to the surface. Kelly was going to block the hole where Annie had disappeared. We all collected our spare jackets, shoes, and backpacks, stuffing it in the hole along with any tools and debris we could find along the cellar. I was going to try and call for help again. There was a slight gap at the bottom of the door where I could slide the phone through. It might be just enough to get a bar. I used a long sleeve of plastic from a Slim Jim and put it under the phone so I could drag it back in carefully. I put the phone down, pressed a call, and slid it out, hoping those extra inches would be enough. It briefly sounded like a call went through, but I couldn't hear anyone picking up. It was raining outside by now, and the sound drowned out everything else. There was cold water dripping through the door, staining the stone steps on the way down. We weren't going anywhere anytime soon. By the time I dragged my phone back in, the battery was as dead as the rest of this place. Going back the stairs, I almost slipped. I caught my grip, but looked up at the surprised faces of Kelly and Marie standing in the middle of the cellar. "You all right?" Kelly asked. I nodded. Before I got to respond, I saw something moving in one of the other holes. A forearm almost 3 foot long, reaching out into the room. I pointed at it, screaming, just as another wind swept through the room, this time blowing out the flame of the oil lamp completely. There was commotion. I couldn't tell who screamed the most, Kelly Marie or me. Someone was in pain. One voice grew more distant and suddenly stopped, a dragging noise dwarfed by panic crying. I touched the walls. I forced myself to think of my own body. I was unharmed. I was all right, but someone down there wasn't. That was just it down there. It was down there, not up the stairs. Come up here, I whispered. Up the stairs. A quiet sobbing. Step by step, someone came up the stairs. The thought hit me that it might be none of them. It could be Annie, it could be whatever took her. There was no way to be sure, and with the last light snuffed out, there was nothing to prevent my mind from filling in the blanks. As a hand grabbed my leg, I screamed, startling poor Kelly, who was the one coming up. We made our way to the top of the stairs, pushing our backs against the door. We made ourselves small and tried to keep quiet. A sliver of light made its way through the cracks in the door. For a good half an hour or so, we just sat there trying to find the courage to speak. Finally, Kelly whispered to me. It grabbed her ankle, she said. It crept along the floor and G grabbed her ankle. Instinctively, I moved my feet up and hugged my knees close to my chest. Did you see it? I whispered back. Jay, just the fingers, she said. It had really long fingers. My leg cramped up and I stopped feeling anything in my toes. I couldn't move, and neither could Kelly. We could barely breathe. I tried to listen past the pitter-patter of rain, but there was nothing coming from downstairs. Instead, my mind filled in the blanks, imagining all kinds of noises. I could almost hear the way Annie pounded on the door, calling for help. I could hear Marie's gentle weeping, and if I let my mind stray just a little bit too far, I could hear the snapping of bones and the ripping of fabric. My pulse was racing so hard it hurt my head, making me bob my neck back and forth like a fish out of water. Kelly didn't say a word. We just held each other close, waiting second by second for dawn to come. It must have been an hour, maybe two, before I heard something. There was a shuffling noise outside on the other side of the door. I perked up to listen, and Kelly did the same. Footsteps, someone walking by. I saw the outline of Kelly's face as we looked at one another, quietly contemplating our options. Then a voice. ... Are you still in there? A young girl, maybe 10 or 12. We'd seen her run with the local kids. Yes, Kelly whispered back. You need to go get help. Call the police. And you need to open the door. I can't do that, the girl sighed. The chipper they put there is real heavy. I can't. Then you need to go get help, Kelly roared. Right now. The girl took off immediately. For what purpose, we couldn't tell. Maybe she was going to get help. Maybe she got scared off. We didn't know. Either way, she was gone. And shortly after, there was a sound coming from downstairs, a chill wind blowing through the cellar carrying a strange, musty scent. We tensed up. I held my breath. A light tip-tap of something poking against the stone steps, then nothing. I looked at Kelly and held her hand. Then she was pulled down. It was quick. She held onto my wrist like her life depended on it, and I slid down 3 steps. I held onto her and pulled, but the force at the other end was too strong. She kicked and screamed like a wounded animal, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, something came loose, and she scampered back up the stairs. Pushing ourselves against the door, I could see her foot was bleeding. Her shoe had come off, and at least 2 toes were broken at a strange angle. There were marks along the middle of her foot, bite marks. I could see the imprint of human molars on her big toe. We huddled against the door. Kelly's eyes were wide with panic, scratching at the wood until her acrylic nails came off. It didn't take long for it to return, a long white arm making its way up the stairs, a hand tip-tapping against the stone steps like a spider, and far down into the dark, I could see 3 pairs of eyes reflecting the sliver of moonlight coming through the door. 6 eyes parted into sets of 2. We threw our shoes, we kicked, we screamed. It retreated only to try again, and again, and again. As soon as there was a moment of quiet, it came back poking and prodding at our readiness. In a moment of silence, Kelly and I just held one another. I eventually came to realize that there was a new sound coming from downstairs. It'd been there for some time, but we'd been too busy to notice it. A low rhythmic hum like a deep cackle. A laugh. It had stopped playing with us. Seconds later, 2 arms shot out of the dark. One grabbing me by the hair, the other grabbing Kelly by the throat. We were immediately pulled down step by step by step. Within seconds, I could feel the floor as we reached the cellar. My hands fumbled for something to grab, only to feel the glass shards of the now broken oil lamp next to me. Grabbing the largest shard I could, I let it sink into my palm as I stabbed what had grabbed me over and over and over and over. The moment it let go, I dove for Kelly. I drove the shard into the pale white arm, grabbing her, forcing it to let go. A dark blue kind of blood, thicker than jelly, pooled around the edge of the shard as both arms sunk back into the holes. Kelly was barely breathing, struggling to get air past her neck. I grabbed her under her arms and tiptoed my way back up the stairs, only to see those white arms slowly coming back out. I couldn't survive another attack. It'd be our last. I dragged Kelly back up the stairs, hoping against hope we'd make it somehow. She kicked helplessly at the white fingers that poked at her wounded feet, teasing her, and a reminder that it was going to get her next time. Laughter. ... No, Kelly mumbled with what little breath she could muster. ... No. We reached the top of the stairs. The arms grew closer, nails tip-tapping against the stone steps. It was joyful, eager, expectant. I pressed my back against the door. If it came to it, I would have no choice but to drop Kelly. I had to do whatever it took to make it out. I remember coming to that conscious decision that if it came down to it, I'd do it. I had to. Then I lost my balance. The door gave out from behind me as it opened. I fell backwards, keeping Kelly in my arms. A sudden burst of moonlight lit up the hallway as a mound of pale limbs retreated into the dark. The local kids had pulled an old, rusted-out machine aside, unlodging the door. Kelly coughed, crawling away from the entrance. To see a grown woman crawling through the dirt like that in a panicked weeping, I'll never get that image out of my head. Even the kids who trapped us seemed shocked. We thought you could open it, one of them said. It wasn't meant T to get stuck. The blonde kid with the white shirt, he wasn't smirking anymore. I just stayed there, in the rain, the palm of my hand slipping on a couple of trampled petals from a blue sunflower. I looked at the cellar, unblinking. Even then, despite the rain and the excuses and the weeping, I could hear the tip-tapping of nails against the stone steps. Something waited for us to slip up, for someone to look the other way, for another chance to take it all away in the blink of an eye. This was a couple years ago, as I mentioned. It was all written up as an animal attack, but there wasn't even an attempt to elaborate. Just an animal attack. The local sheriff ordered the place permanently closed, so they just filled it up with gravel and dirt. They never recovered Marie or Annie. They never even said what happened to them. Kelly had to amputate part of her foot, but was otherwise fine, but she, like me, wasn't going to be the same ever again.